Somewhere in your house right now, there is a box. On a closet shelf or in a dresser drawer you haven't opened since the funeral. Worn velvet inside, or a tin that once held butter cookies. And inside are pins, brooches, little sunbursts and flowers and bows, some tarnished, some missing a stone. And you've already decided, without ever really looking, that none of them are worth anything. Let me be honest before we start. Most old brooches are not worth a fortune, but a small number are worth far more than anyone in your family imagined, and the reason nobody noticed is almost never that the piece looked expensive and got overlooked. It's the opposite. The valuable ones usually look like nothing at all. Plain, odd, a little homemade, even. So instead of reading you a list of famous brand names, which is what everyone else does, I'm going to teach you to read the back of a brooch. The clasp, the hinge, the pin stem, the tiny stamps nobody ever turns over to look at. The back of a brooch is a birth certificate, and almost nobody knows how to read it. 15 brooches, and 15 things you can check tonight at your own kitchen table. And number 1? A woman pulled it out of a cardboard box on the ground at a flea market and paid $15. Christie's, the Philadelphia Museum of Art, and the artist's own foundation all documented what happened next. Number 15. The circle pin. Almost every American woman over 60 has one, and I want to set your expectations honestly before I start showing you treasure. A simple gold or silver ring, worn on the collar of a cardigan. In some schools it meant you were going steady, and worn upside down it meant something else entirely. Most circle pins trade around $10 to $40, and no storytelling changes that. But this is where you learn your first skill, and it's the most useful thing in this whole video. Turn it over. Sterling means solid silver. 14K or 10K means solid gold. But here's the mark almost nobody understands. 1/20th 12 kgf. That's gold-filled, and gold-filled is not plating. It's a real layer of gold bonded under heat and pressure, and that layer had to be at least 1/20th of the piece's total weight. Modern electroplate is measured in microns and wears through in a few years. Nobody teaches you this, not because it's secret, but because there's no money in it. You can't patent a fraction. Number 14. The Victorian bar brooch. A straight little bar of gold or gold-filled metal, often with a seed pearl in the center, sometimes engraved with a name or a date. Your great-grandmother wore one at the throat of a high collar. Tiny versions were given at christenings, which is why they're called baby pins. Flip it over and look at 3 things. First, the catch. Is it just an open C shape with no closing mechanism? That's a C clasp, and as a rough guide, C clasps were standard before about 1900. Second, the hinge. Older pieces very often used a tube hinge, a small rolled cylinder rather than a stamped one. Third, and people miss this entirely, look at how far the pin stem sticks past the end of the brooch. On genuinely early pieces, it extends well beyond the frame, sometimes half an inch, because it had to punch through heavy Victorian fabric. Now a warning, the exciting videos skip. Clasps get replaced. A jeweler in 1950 might have soldered a modern safety catch onto an 1880 brooch because grandma kept losing it. So the clasp is a clue, not a verdict. Plain gold-filled bar pins trade modestly, but one in solid gold with seed pearls and fine engraving has been known to bring several $100s, and the ones with Etruscan revival granulation, those tiny applied beads of gold, sit higher still. Number 13. The Christmas tree pin. Oh, this one. If you grew up in America in the 50s or 60s, somebody in your family had one, and it came out of the tissue paper every December with the good tablecloth. The serious jewelry world has never taken these seriously for 1 second. There is no auction house department for Christmas, and that neglect is exactly why they're still findable. Turn one over. A good vintage tree usually has a japanned back, meaning the base metal is coated in hard black lacquer so it wouldn't dull the color of the stones from behind. Check that the branches are built up in separate layers rather than stamped flat from one sheet, and that the main stones are prong set with only small accents glued. And here's the tip I love. Look for the name Hollycraft. They did something almost no other costume house bothered with. They stamped the year into the piece. You'll find marks reading Hollycraft, then COPR, then a 4-digit year, 1950. 1955. A piece of costume jewelry that tells you its own birthday. Most trees trade around $15 to $40, but early-dated Hollycraft pieces and scarcer makers like Warner have been reported considerably higher. Number 12. The lapel watch. People mistake this for a brooch and never look at it properly. A decorative pin, often a bow or a fleur-de-lis, with a small round watch hanging from it, and the watch face is upside down. It's upside down on purpose. It pinned to the front of a blouse, so when the wearer glanced down at her own chest, the numbers read the right way up to her. These were hugely popular from the Edwardian years through mid-century, and nurses wore them for decades. A wristwatch gets in the way when you're scrubbing to the elbow all day. Here's why you must not put this one back in the drawer. Watch cases were made to a different standard than costume jewellery, and the makers stamped them. Open the back case gently with a thumbnail and look inside. You may find 14K, 18K, gold filled with a warranty stamp, a serial number, and on the movement itself, a jewel count. I've watched people carry a solid gold case around in a jar of buttons for 30 years because the watch didn't run. Whether the movement is dead has almost nothing to do with what the case is made of. Number 11. The sweetheart pin. During the Second World War, a young man leaving for the service would often buy a small pin before he shipped out and give it to the woman he was leaving behind. His mother. His wife. A girl he hoped would still be there. It carried the insignia of his branch. Army Air Force's wings. A Navy anchor. The Marine Corps globe and anchor. She wore it on her coat every day, for years, so everyone she passed knew that somebody belonging to her was over there. During the war, base metals like brass, copper and nickel were restricted for military production, so a great many of these were made in sterling silver instead. A wartime pin you assumed was cheap costume metal is quite often solid silver. Turn it over and look for the word sterling. And here's a test that costs nothing. Hold a refrigerator magnet to it. Sterling is not magnetic. If the pin jumps to the magnet, you're looking at steel or plated base metal. But here's the part I most want you to hear. Plain sweetheart pins trade around $20 to $60. The ones that climb are the ones with the paperwork. The card it was sold on, the box, the letter that came with it, his name engraved on the back. Provenance is the multiplier. So don't separate the pin from the envelope. I've seen families sell the pin and keep the letter and cut the value roughly in half without ever knowing. Nobody's in a hurry to tell you that, because a letter is not inventory. You can't restock a letter. Number 10. The Scottish pebble brooch. In 1852, Queen Victoria and Prince Albert bought Balmoral in the Highlands, and within a few years, everything Scottish became the height of fashion across Britain and then America. Picture a silver disc, or a thistle, or the sweet twin heart shape they call a luckenbooth. Set into it like a mosaic are polished native stones. Banded agate, bloodstone, jasper, that warm, smoky quartz from the Cairngorm Mountains. Reproductions are everywhere, and here's how you tell them apart in 10 seconds with no equipment. On a genuine Victorian piece, every single stone is a different shape, because each was cut by hand to fit the silver cell it sits in, and the silver was hand-closed over the edges. The pattern is slightly irregular, because human hands made it. On a reproduction, the stones are uniform, machine-cut, often identical, and glued flat into a stamped tray. Glue is the giveaway. Are the stones held by metal or sitting in yellowed adhesive? Fine examples have been known to trade in the low hundreds, and exceptional silver-mounted ones well beyond. They're too regional for the glossy catalogues, which is exactly why they still turn up in American estate boxes for almost nothing. Number 9. The Mourning brooch. Prince Albert died in 1861, and Queen Victoria wore black for the rest of her life. 40 years. A grieving empire followed her, and the seaside town of Whitby in Yorkshire became the centre of an entire industry because of a black material that washed out of its cliffs. That material is jet, and jet is not a stone. It's fossilized wood, compressed for something like 180 million years. Genuine Whitby jet is astonishingly light, almost hollow feeling for its size, and warm to the touch, never cold. And here's the classic collector's test, completely safe. Rub it gently on unglazed ceramic. The rough, unfinished ring on the bottom of a coffee mug works perfectly. Jet leaves a brown streak, not black, brown. Now the three imposters. French jet isn't jet at all, it's black glass. Cold to the touch, noticeably heavier, and you can often find a faint mold seam. Vulcanite is hardened rubber, and time gives it away. Vulcanite that has sat in sunlight fades from black toward a dull khaki brown at the exposed edges. Bog oak is Irish, genuinely brown rather than black, usually carved with harps, shamrocks, and little castles. Now a safety word, and I mean it. No flame, no hot needle, no acid. Every one of those is destructive, and I've seen beautiful 150-year-old carved jet ruined by somebody testing it with a lighter because a video told them to. And one honest note. Some pieces from this era include ivory, tortoiseshell, or certain corals. Federal and state law restricts selling those, and the rules have changed in recent years, so check the current regulations in your state before you list anything. Number 8. The trembler. This is my favorite thing in this entire video, and I've watched collectors walk straight past them for years. A trembler brooch, sometimes called by its French name, en tremblant, has its flower heads or butterfly wings mounted on tiny coiled springs. Sitting still, it looks like an ordinary flower pin. But the moment the woman wearing it moved, or breathed, or laughed, the blossoms shivered and threw light in a way a rigid brooch simply cannot. An 18th century fine jewellery trick, revived by the Victorians and again by the best costume houses in the 40s and 50s. Hold it under a lamp and tap the frame gently with a fingernail. If the flower heads bounce and keep bouncing independently of the body, you have a trembler. And check whether somebody has soldered the springs flat. It happens constantly. Some well-meaning jeweler decided the wobbly bit was broken and fixed it. That repair can take a substantial bite out of the value, and it's invisible unless you know to tap it. Here's your invisible economics lesson. You cannot photograph movement. In a catalogue, in a listing, in a thumbnail, a trembler looks exactly like every other flower pin. The one thing that makes it special is the one thing that doesn't survive a photograph. So it gets catalogued as a flower brooch, priced as a flower brooch, and sold as a flower brooch. That gap is where collectors have quietly made money for 40 years. Before the top 7, 2 quick things. If this is useful, subscribing genuinely helps, because we go this deep every week. I've also put together a free companion guide called the Brooch Back Blueprint, with the clasp dating chart, the metal mark table, the jet tests, and a good deal more we don't have room for here. The link is in the description. And a serious word I won't skip. I am not a certified appraiser, and nothing here is a professional appraisal, an insurance valuation, or legal advice. Every price I mention is a general range drawn from reported market results, and condition, repairs, and provenance change everything. Before you buy, sell, or insure anything you believe is valuable, have it examined by a certified appraiser and check your own state and local regulations. Number 7. Hattie Carnegie. She was born Henrietta Kannengeiser in Vienna and came to America as a girl with essentially nothing, and she built one of the great American fashion houses. Here's the part that delights me. By every account, she never designed a piece of jewellery herself and could not sew. What she had was an eye, and the nerve to hire the right hands and put her name on the result. What collectors chase are her figurals, the animals, the stylized faces, the fruit and flower clusters, often with genuinely good stones and enamel work you wouldn't expect from a name most people associate with dresses. But here's the honest complication, and it's the whole reason her pieces slip through estate sales for $1. Her marks are wildly inconsistent. Some read Carnegie, some read Hattie Carnegie, some carry only initials, and a great many carry nothing at all. Because like most fashion houses, she used outside contract manufacturers, and those workshops made pieces for a dozen other names on the same benches in the same week. So you can't rely on the signature. You have to learn the look, the weight, and the quality of the setting work. Number 6. The micro mosaic. This one is a small miracle, and most people who own one have no idea what they're holding. In the 1800s, wealthy young people took what was called the Grand Tour, months through Europe, finishing in Rome. And in Rome, they bought souvenirs, not postcards. These. A brooch showing the Colosseum, or a ruined temple, or the famous doves drinking from a bowl. They were made from something called smalti filati. Craftsmen drew molten glass into hair-fine threads, snipped them into tesserae, tiny tiles, some smaller than a grain of sand, and set them one at a time by hand. A single brooch might hold thousands. The home test is beautifully simple. Take a 10-power loupe, or honestly, the magnifier on your telephone. If you can see thousands of separate little tiles with the faintest grid of grout between them, you have a real micromosaic. If you see printed dots, or a perfectly smooth, glossy surface, or a repeating pattern, you have a transfer print imitating one. Then check for missing tesserae, little dark pits where a tile has fallen out, because that does affect value. Fine examples have been known to trade in the hundreds, and in gold mounts considerably more. And why does nobody talk about them? Because they fall between two stools. The jewellery department thinks they're decorative arts. The decorative arts department thinks they're jewellery. So they sit in the middle, uncatalogued, and end up in a box of costume pins. Number 5. Schiaparelli, and an honest correction. There's a story repeated constantly on this subject, and a good part of it isn't right, and I'd rather be useful than exciting. Elsa Schiaparelli was a real and remarkable figure, rival of Chanel, collaborator of the Surrealists, the woman behind Shocking Pink. All true, all documented. But here's the part usually left out. The signed Schiaparelli brooches that actually turn up in American jewellery boxes are, overwhelmingly, not her 1930s Surrealist couture pieces. In 1949, she opened a New York company, Schiaparelli Jewels, and licensed her name for mass production. Lisner and Company had been her authorized American importer and distributor since the late 30s, and jewelry makers in Philadelphia executed the designs. And there's a marvelous dating trick buried in this. The Aurora Borealis rhinestone, that iridescent oil-slick finish that throws rainbow fire, was developed with Swarovski in the middle of the 1950s. So if someone tells you a brooch full of Aurora Borealis stones is a 30s piece Salvador Dalí had a hand in, the stones themselves are telling you otherwise. A material cannot predate its own invention. The marks help too. Lowercase block letters generally point to before 1949. The familiar script signature runs from 49 onward. All capitals generally means the later period, after the rights to the name were sold. Now don't hear me saying these aren't worth having. They absolutely are, and they've been reported trading well into the hundreds. I'm saying know which one you have, so nobody sells you a 1955 licensed brooch at a 1937 couture price. That's what expertise is for. Not making things sound bigger, making them accurate. Number 4. Juliana. This is for anyone who has ever turned a brooch over, found nothing stamped on the back, and put it straight in the giveaway pile. Please stop doing that. DeLisa and Elster were a New York manufacturing firm founded in the 1940s by William DeLisa and Harold Elster. They didn't sell under their own name. They made jewelry for other people. Dozens of them. In 1967, they launched a house line out of a Fifth Avenue showroom and called it Juliana, after Frank DeLisa's mother. And here's the extraordinary part. Juliana pieces were never stamped. They were sold with a paper hang tag, and the run lasted only a year or two. Every one of those tags went in the bin the first time the piece was worn. So collectors had to reconstruct the identification from the object itself. And they did. A collector named Cheryl Kilmer tracked down Frank DeLisa himself, and jewelry historians and appraisers, including J.B. Siegel, documented the construction piece by piece. Thanks entirely to that work, you can now identify an unsigned brooch made 60 years ago from the back alone. Get a lamp, because this is fiddly. First, look at how the round stones are seated on the reverse. If the little cups holding them are soldered in overlapping pairs forming a shape like a figure 8, that's what collectors call figure 8 puddling, and it's a strong indicator. Second, on these pieces, the hinge and the catch are soldered directly onto the body of the brooch, rather than sitting on a separate applied plate. Third, the large stones should be prong set with only small accents glued. That last one matters, because modern imports copy this look, and the giveaway is that the copies glue everything. And notice the economics. This knowledge was built by unpaid collectors sharing photographs, arguing on forums, driving to conventions to talk to an old man about his mother's name. No auction house was ever going to fund that. You can't build a glossy catalogue around a manufacturer whose entire output is unsigned. Number 3. The Wartime Sterling Brooch. This is the one I'd most like you to check tonight, because a lot of you own one and have written it off as costume. Picture a big, curvy, confident brooch. A bow, a ribbon, an enormous stylized flower, in a warm, rosy pink gold colour rather than bright yellow, noticeably heavy in the hand. And when you turn it over, there may be no maker's name at all. Just one word: sterling. Here's what happened. During the war years, the War Production Board restricted base metals, brass and copper and nickel, for military use, and the costume jewellery industry, which had built everything on cheap white metal, suddenly had nothing to work with. So they turned to sterling silver, which was still available, and gold washed it to keep that warm, luxurious colour. The trade calls that vermeil. Gold over sterling. Do you see the joke? For a few years in the middle of the 1940s, American costume jewelry was made of solid silver. The fake stuff was real. Houses like Mazer Brothers, later Jomaz, and Raja were doing genuinely fine work in it. So, your kitchen table test. Weight, it will feel heavier than you expect. The magnet. Sterling isn't magnetic, so if it leaps to your refrigerator magnet, it isn't silver. And the stamp. Look along the edge of the pin stem, along the back of the frame, and on the little plate near the hinge. Sterling. Sometimes just the number 925. And one thing please don't do. Don't polish the dark tone out of the recesses of a figural piece. That darkness isn't dirt, it's deliberate patina the maker put there to give the design depth, and scrubbing it out with silver polish can take real money off the piece in about 4 minutes. Number 2. The studio brooch that looks like a school project. After the Second World War, a group of American artists in Greenwich Village and out in the Bay Area began making jewelry as sculpture. Not adornment. Sculpture that happened to be wearable. Silver, copper, brass, sometimes a rough stone or a bit of found material. And their work looks, to an untrained eye, exactly like something somebody made in a night class. Art Smith was one of them. Born in 1917, raised in Brooklyn, a black artist running a studio in the village at a time when that took genuine nerve. His brooches are big, curving, biomorphic silver shapes that seem to grow around the body rather than sit on it. In 2008, the Brooklyn Museum mounted a full exhibition of his work, organized by their curator of decorative arts, Barry Harwood, and it traveled on to Cincinnati, to Dallas, and to the High Museum in Atlanta. Sam Kramer worked a few streets away and was gloriously strange. He advertised his shop with the line, "Fantastic jewelry for people who are slightly mad." And he meant it. He set found objects, glass eyes, meteorite fragments, into silver. And out in California, Margaret DePatter was cutting stones in ways nobody had tried, so that light passed through them and rearranged what you saw behind. Her work is held by the Museum of Modern Art, the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, and the Art Institute of Chicago. So how do you spot one in a box of junk? Look for these together. Hand-fabricated construction rather than casting, meaning you can see where sheet metal was cut, hammered, and soldered. Asymmetry that looks deliberate rather than clumsy. Unusual materials sitting next to silver, and very often a small hand-stamped maker's mark, initials, or a tiny symbol, rather than a company name. These have been known to bring thousands of dollars, and museum-grade examples considerably more. And yet they're walked past constantly, because they don't look like jewelry to most people. They look like somebody's craft project. Number 1. Alexander Calder. Alexander Calder is one of the great American artists of the 20th century. The mobiles. The enormous red steel stabiles standing in plazas in every major city. You know his work even if you don't know his name. What far fewer people know is that he made somewhere in the region of 1,800 pieces of jewelry. Every one by hand. Brass, wire, silver, sometimes gold, often with a shard of broken pottery or a piece of beach glass caught in a coil. He made them as gifts for friends and family, and sold them at small gallery shows to keep money coming in during the Depression. The curator, Elizabeth Agro, at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, has noted that one Calder brooch in that museum's collection was originally offered by the artist for $25. Peggy Guggenheim wore them. Georgia O'Keeffe was given one. And he refused every offer to mass-produce them because the whole point was that each one was made once, by his own hands. Now here's what a Calder brooch looks like to somebody who doesn't know. Bent brass wire, hammered flat in places, a spiral, no stones, or a chip of something broken, no polish. It looks, honestly, like wire from a coat hanger that somebody twisted up one afternoon. So let me tell you what happened to Norma Eiffel. In 2005, at the Brooklyn Flea Market in New York, she was going through a cardboard box sitting on the ground, among electrical odds and ends and old clothes. She found a brass necklace, a spiral thing. She liked it. She thought it looked tribal. She paid $15, and every time she wore it, people stopped her to admire it. 3 years later, she saw a poster for an exhibition at the Philadelphia Museum of Art called Calder Jewelry. A friend looked at the poster, then at her necklace, and told her to make a telephone call. She was put in touch with Elizabeth Agro, the curator who organized that exhibition. Agro believed it was real and sent her to the Calder Foundation in New York, who examined it and entered it into the archive as genuine. In September of 2013, Christie's sold it. A brass-piece Calder made around 1938. It had been estimated at $200,000 to $300,000, and the reported result was $267,750. From a box on the ground, $15. Now, I'm not going to insult you by suggesting there's a Calder in your closet. There almost certainly isn't. But sit with the actual lesson, because it isn't luck. Norma Eiffel picked it up because she thought it was interesting. She kept it because she liked it. And when the moment came, she was curious enough to make the phone call instead of assuming she was being silly. Every part of that is something you can do. So tonight, go get the box. Take it to the kitchen table where the light is good. Get a magnet off the refrigerator, the magnifier on your telephone, and a coffee mug turned upside down. Go through them one at a time, back first. Read the clasp. Read the hinge. Read the stamps. Feel the weight. Tap the flowers and see if anything trembles. Put anything strange, anything homemade looking, anything unsigned and heavy into a separate pile. That pile is the one you take to a certified appraiser before you buy, sell, or insure anything. And do check the regulations in your own state. Now, I'd love to hear from you, and I do read the comments. First, tell me which one you're going to check tonight. The lapel watch? The Wartime sterling? Is there a sweetheart pin in your family? And do you know whose it was? Tell me that story, because those are the ones I look forward to reading all week. And second, let me pick a fight, gently. I think our market has become far too obsessed with signatures. I would rather own a beautifully made, unsigned brooch in perfect condition than a signed one that's bent, missing stones, and badly repaired. The market disagrees with me. The market pays for the name and forgives the damage. I think that's backwards, and I think it's why the real bargains are still sitting out there in unsigned boxes. Tell me I'm wrong. I genuinely want to hear it. Thank you for sitting with me through all 15. Go find the box, turn everything over, and whatever you decide to do, don't let anybody talk you into giving it away before you've read the back. I'll see you next time.